China steps up as the world's biggest feature film market. It's giving Hollywood even more incentive to comply with Beijing's censorship. A New Yorker recounts being put under lockdown in Shanghai. Living in isolation for 2 months once drove him to a dangerous point. A top U.S. military commander fears China is speeding up plans to replace the U.S. on the world stage. That's as the communist regime deepens a plan to recruit technology talents from around the world. And the International Olympic Committee is going to buy CCP-virus vaccines from China. But this year's host country, Japan, is refusing to use them.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Hollywood has more incentive now to comply with Chinese censorship. That's because China is now the biggest film market in the world. NTD's Don Ma has more on Hollywood and Chinese censorship.
For the first time in history, China became the world's #1 film market. This according to 2020 movie market data. And hot on the heels came a nearly 100-page research study on China's censorship in Hollywood. The research is by literary and human rights group PEN America. It details how the movie industry in the West caters to Chinese censors. That's in order to gain access to the Chinese film market. As per the study, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, sees films as a means of soft power. It uses this soft power to reinforce a state-approved image of the regime. For the CCP, several topics are untouchable. That's Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, the South China Sea, the spiritual practice Falun Gong, top CCP leaders, the pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and Hong Kong. In recent years, many major movie studios have made more money in China than in the United States. This gives strong economic incentives for Hollywood to play by Beijing's rules. Marvel Studios' blockbuster superhero movie, Doctor Strange, gives a prominent example of censorship. In the movie, a major Tibetan character was played by British actress Tilda Swinton. The writer for the movie says this was because they didn't want to acknowledge Tibet and therefore risk getting the movie banned by the Chinese regime.
He originates from Tibet, so if you acknowledge that Tibet is a place and that he's Tibetan, you risk alienating 1 billion people who think that that's bullshit, and risk the Chinese government going, hey, you know, one of the biggest film watching countries in the world, we're not going to show your movie because you decided to get political.
Beijing frowns upon the international community for seeing Tibet as separate from China. It labels Tibet's spiritual leader Dalai Lama as a separatist. That's because he advocated for Tibet's freedoms. Tibet is under Chinese communist rule, but it has its own political leader and spiritual leader. And Hollywood is complying with these censors not just due to economic incentives. There's also a risk those who don't comply will be boycotted. One Hollywood producer told PEN America they're afraid to make movies critical of Communist China because, quote, you or your company will be actively blacklisted. Another producer told the group it's expected that you'll never work again if you insult China. Star of the 1990 film Pretty Woman, Richard Gere has been reportedly blacklisted by the CCP. In 2017, he told Hollywood Reporter that someone told him they can't make a movie with him because it would upset the Chinese. He has been very vocal about supporting Tibet and about criticizing CCP's human rights abuses.
I wonder if Deng Xiaoping is actually watching this right now, with his children and his grandchildren, and with the knowledge that what a horrendous human rights situation there is in China, not only towards their own people, but to Tibet as well. And I was wondering if this kind of
During the interview with Hollywood Reporter, he said, quote, there was something I was going to do with the Chinese director, and 2 weeks before we were going to shoot, he called saying, sorry, I can't do it. Gere explained that this person canceled because his family has been threatened by authorities. Gere said, quote, if I had worked with this director, he said his family would never have been allowed to leave the country ever again. He would never work. Many Hollywood professionals PEN America spoke with pointed out to them the significance of China's influence in Hollywood. One of them said, quote, this is affecting not just what Chinese audiences see, but what Americans get to watch. Reporting by Don Ma, NTD News.
What's it like under Chinese lockdown restrictions? We spoke to a New Yorker who went through 2 months of lockdown in Shanghai. He says the experience left a deep imprint on him. NTD's Juliet Song has the details.
This photo was taken on January.
It's been over a year since New Yorker Mariano Arce was put under lockdown in China, but the memories are still fresh. In 2020, Arce worked as a teacher in Shanghai. He says he was paid well and was building his life in the city. But in January, when the CCP-virus swept through China, authorities put Shanghai under strict lockdown orders. No one was allowed to leave their home. In the residential compound where Arce was living,
Did they tape doors? Certain floors, as far as I'm aware of, they were taping doors.
but the building staff didn't tape his floor for a reason.
And it's because usually where foreigners live, they didn't do stuff like that.
But sealing doors was just the beginning.
The police would come around often and make sure people were staying inside the building.
Arce says even if people wanted to leave, there was nowhere to go. Everything was closed, even the sidewalks were effectively roped off.
And if you're an American or if you're a foreigner who doesn't know any of the language or the nuances, then it's really scary because you don't know what's happening and everybody else does, and not everybody really wants to tell you. If your relationship is good with some of the local staff or that you work with perhaps, or like the local folks that live with you or live around you, they may tell you, but they may not.
Arce was part of a work group chat on Chinese social media WeChat, but that too stayed quiet during the lockdown.
I was like, why is nobody talking? Like, this is crazy. And, you know, they would always say Big Brother's watching.
He was working from home at the time. 2 weeks in, Arce says he started feeling the impact of lockdown.
I was already starting to feel like, oh, things are not normal. This is not right.
He says it felt like walls were closing in on him.
You're just in this one space. It just feels like it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then suddenly you're just in one spot.
And there was another problem. Arce lost his father to cancer in 2019 and was taking medications to calm his nerves and cope with the loss. But the lockdown brought that to a sudden halt.
I was hoping to get it during the pandemic, but I think the government recognized that they didn't want anybody around the hospitals, and so they said those things were non-essential, and I just get like, I can actually feel the physical effects on my body. Like I can feel it in my eyes, I can feel it in my face that I'm sad already just thinking about how that all went down.
His anxiety was building, but medication was no longer an available option, so he turned to whiskey instead.
And I'd order 2 of them a week. I don't drink, like I'm not a drinker. I was drinking.
As his mental state worsened, the situation came to a head when he found himself in danger. It started when he opened a floor-to-ceiling window to cool off. At the time, he was on the phone with his friend Cindy.
I just was walking to the window, but when I thought I was joking when I was on the phone with Cindy, and I was like, I don't want to scream, but I was like, Cindy, like, I'm like, I want to leave, I want to go out, when is it going to end? When is it going to end? And I started crying so relentlessly. I didn't actually think I was crying. I thought I was just faking it. I thought I was just having a good joke.
Down below, on the street surrounding the apartment building,
And people started crowding around. People started crowding around my window.
his friend warned him to get away from the window, or else people might think he's going to jump. After he got off the phone with her, he dialed a hotline that connected him with a crisis counselor, who gave him the same advice.
The girl said to me, don't jump out the window. I said, what are you talking about? She says, the security guard tells me that you're trying to jump out the window.
Eventually, he backed away from the window. Soon, a car came and rushed him to a medical center. While Arce was struggling in China, his friend Wilson, who lives in the U.S., was getting more and more concerned for him.
Is he going to be able to get out of there? Was what the whole thing. Could he get out? When could he get out? Type of thing. Were they allowing people to leave? Well, if they weren't allowing people to, it was like that became frightening for me.
Shanghai's lockdown ended last March. When he was finally free, Arce was left to face a tough choice.
And I felt sad that I had to leave my job in China and leave my apartment and scooter and everything that I worked for. I felt bad that I had to leave that just because I couldn't get help.
But rumors started circulating, saying authorities might soon build quarantine camps for virus patients. Even though he wasn't sick, he says he was still scared. In a video call, he reached out to his family for advice.
And they were like, get your butt home. You don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't seem like it's getting better. At least if we're here together.
And soon, he was on a $4,000 flight home after running through the airport to board his plane.
Hello, ni hao.
Oh, where do I go?
This is a seat number. No, this one, 3H.
3H? Okay, 谢谢。你好 hello. 3H. Okay.
He called Wilson from the airport between flights to tell him he was on his way home.
God is good. He works it all out.
Now RC is back in his hometown, New York City.
I still get sometimes upset or anxious certain ways, but in terms of things getting better, they did because I've just learned that I can do it. I used to actually think I couldn't. I used to think I'm not going to get through this. But I learned in China that you had no choice. And it made me a stronger person. That's a positive. I think that's worth sharing.
He's now reunited with his family and working to build a new life on home soil. Juliet Song, NTD News.
A top U.S. military commander fears the Chinese Communist Party is speeding up plans to replace the U.S. on the world stage. Admiral Philip Davidson is head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He told a Senate Armed Services hearing earlier this week that China's military has been making vast advances in both its size and capabilities. Indo-Pacific Command indicates that China's Navy is now larger than the U.S. Navy, and that in 4 years, China will have more aircraft carriers and ships deployed in the Western Pacific than the U.S. China says it aims to become a world-class military by 2050, but Davidson is voicing concern that the communist regime is accelerating its ambitions to replace U.S. leadership in international bodies. The CCP seems to be expanding its recruitment of researchers from overseas. The aim is likely to advance Beijing's technological development. The CCP announced this as part of their 14th fifth-year plan at its most important annual meeting earlier this week. One of the goals is to recruit more talents from outside China. Areas such as aerospace, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and life sciences are especially important. For the recruits, incentives involve not only good payments, but also an entire system of social benefits. That includes good educational opportunities for the researchers' children. The CCP is also set to allow foreigners to work in Chinese state-owned institutions. It will set up research organizations with international standards. That's in order to provide the recruits with better research conditions. U.S.-based economist Chen Xiaonong told Radio Free Asia he believes the new plan is an extended version of the 1,000 Talents program. Through the 1,000 Talents program, the CCP recruited academics from Western countries. They are invited to teach or do research in China. Both Chinese and non-Chinese researchers are targeted. Since 2018, the U.S. has dealt a heavy blow to the program. The FBI arrested many of the recruits for espionage and theft of technology. Chen says the new plan is even bolder than the 1,000 Talents program. It incentivizes the recruits to move to China completely, with technology in their hands. He believes the ultimate goal of the plan is to boost the communist regime's military. Dozens of justice seekers in China are reportedly in detention. They were arrested behind the scenes of China's biggest political conference of the year, which concluded yesterday. NTD's Becky Zhou has the story.
Chinese police are believed to have detained dozens of petitioners during the CCP's most important meeting of the year, the 2 sessions last week. The aim is to keep the petitioners out of the public eye. One of the petitioners detained is a 57-year-old lady from Shanghai named Ma Ya-lian. NTD interviewed Ma after her release.
They arrested me many times, sending me to labor camps twice. They've detained me in black prisons for countless times.
Ma started petitioning more than 2 decades ago. That was when Shanghai authorities forcibly demolished her house. According to records from nonprofit organization Independent Chinese Pen Center, Ma appealed to local authorities via the petition system after becoming homeless. She also posted articles about her predicament online. Police officers beat her up and detained her for what they called disrupting social order. Ma also had to spend several years in labor camps.
What we did was completely legal. We just went to file complaints, and that made the authorities' political track record look bad. That drives them over the edge.
Later, she went to Beijing to petition. That's because local courthouses always sided with the regime. Shanghai police arrested Ma at the Beijing railway station. It was believed to prevent her and other petitioners from reporting to central authorities. Ma believes this was made possible because she had to present her ID and use a facial recognition device to buy a train ticket. The railway station shares personal information with the police. She says dozens of other petitioners from Shanghai were also in custody in Beijing. Unlike dissenters, petitioners expect authorities to take action. That's why petitioners often make written requests to authorities. Becky Zhou, NTD News.
And now to Japan. The host of the Summer Olympics will not provide Chinese-made vaccines to participants of the Games. The same goes for the Winter Games in Beijing next year. Japan's Olympic minister said on Friday that Chinese vaccines have not been approved in Japan. The day before, the president of International Olympic Committee announced that the organization will buy CCP-virus vaccines from China. They will be provided to participants of the Olympic Games. This announcement came when the Chinese regime is facing increasing criticism over its suppression of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. But the IOC says it's a sports body and it will not meddle in what it calls China's domestic issues. The CCP considers all human rights issues in the country, as well as its crackdown in Hong Kong and intimidation of Taiwan, as internal affairs. The real efficacy of Chinese vaccines is not 100% clear. That's because their trial data so far is incomplete. The published data generally shows lower efficacy than vaccines produced in other countries. Just when you thought life was starting to return to normal, reports of production delays in key industries could forecast further difficulties ahead. And this time, it might not just hit your pocketbook, but the device in your hand too.
The global chip shortage could be spreading from cars to smartphones. Reuters sources say Qualcomm is struggling to meet demand for semiconductors used in handsets and other gadgets. Key client Samsung reportedly can't get enough chips from the US manufacturer. Demand for Qualcomm processors has soared in recent months. That as Android phone makers battle to win over customers abandoning Huawei, which is beset by US sanctions. But Qualcomm has reportedly struggled to meet demand, itself facing a shortage of some components. One source at a Samsung supplier said the silicon drought was now hitting output of low and mid-range phones. Another said Qualcomm's flagship chips were also running short, potentially hitting high-end handsets. One source at a major contract manufacturer for several brands said it would have to cut output later in the year. A spokesman for the US chipmaker would only reiterate the company's comments earlier in the week, pledging to hit sales targets. The chip shortage first showed up in the car industry. Many major automakers have been forced to halt or slow production due to a lack of semiconductors. The shortage has prompted panic buying of chips, further squeezing supply and prices.
The global semiconductor industry is waiting on an unusual production factor, weather patterns in Taiwan. The island is home to the world's biggest microchip maker, TSMC. The chip industry requires lots of water to keep running. But right now, Taiwan is going through its worst drought in nearly 60 years, and its water reservoirs are critically low. Stakes are high as concerns rise over a worsening chip shortage around the world. The shortage has already forced many car makers to idle because chips are needed to build them too. Major auto companies, including GM, Ford, Honda, and more, have already cut production and warned investors about a slowdown. Europe and the US are trying to find ways to reduce their dependency on Asia for chips. Taiwanese officials say the island will keep chip supply flowing and that their government has made preparations for the water shortage. Monsoon rains usually arrive in May for Taiwan, which may ease the drought. A major trade association of China's chip industry says it will build a working group with its U.S. counterpart. The Chinese Semiconductor Industry Association announced it on Thursday. It will meet twice a year with Washington-based Semiconductor Industry Association. The two will discuss intellectual property and trade policies. The news comes at a time when the Chinese regime is worried about reliance on U.S. chip technology. China is the world's largest consumer of semiconductors, but it only produces about 6% of the chips it uses. The Trump administration has used the technology as a leverage to sanction Huawei. Huawei is a Chinese telecom giant with links to the regime's military, and the sanctions crippled Huawei's once booming smartphone business. Trump also restricted technology exports to China's largest chip maker. That's due to its ties to the regime's military. According to Chinese media, the Biden administration eased the restriction on March 1st. The administration approved American companies to sell certain chip-producing equipment, but not the most advanced ones. Whether it's trade practices or human rights issues, we need a new approach with respect to China. This, according to Canada's official opposition leader, Erin O'Toole. He said it in an interview with the Epoch Times. 2 decades ago, the Western world brought Communist China into the World Trade Organization. It's supposed to be a rules-based trading system. The argument at the time was that free world countries can help China develop economically, and then Communist China would be motivated to respect human rights and the rule of law. But O'Toole says this did not work out. He says, quote, "We cannot allow a country to benefit from the rules-based system where values of human rights are respected, but actually not practice those values themselves." Since joining the WTO, China saw its exports rise significantly, but at the same time, it flouted trade rules and prevented other countries from accessing its market. As a result, Canada has lost close to 550,000 manufacturing jobs, and the U.S. lost 3.4 million jobs as of 2018. O'Toole also raised concerns over the situation in Hong Kong. In recent years, Beijing ramped up its crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. Last year, the regime imposed a new national security law to further crack down on Hong Kong's freedoms. On Thursday, the CCP also passed new laws. Critics say they mark the end of Hong Kong's remaining autonomy. O'Toole urges the current Canadian government to, quote, "wake up to this." Canada's immigration minister says he is not concerned about Chinese influence in the country's visa system. It's over a company run by Chinese police operating a Canadian visa application center in Beijing, something the minister says he sees no issue with. The visa center is currently run by Beijing's Shuangxiong Foreign Service. The company is reportedly owned by Beijing's police agency. According to a Tuesday report by Canadian news outlet Globe and Mail, an overwhelming 86% of employees at the visa center work for Shuangxiong. Canadian opposition parliament members have also raised concerns, saying applicants' personal data will fall into the hands of the Chinese regime. They pointed out that the chair of Shuangxiong also serves as the secretary to the Communist Party, and that the company's general manager works as a deputy secretary. In addition, they highlighted a conflict of interest centered around pro-democracy activists applying at Beijing-affiliated visa centers as they are trying to flee China. The CCP has openly condemned countries for granting activists asylum on many occasions. A Canadian parliamentary committee was heard last week. It suggested removing the CCP's involvement in the visa center. Before you go, our videos are being censored. Some of you say you've been unsubscribed. Others aren't getting notified when we release new videos. We're also being demonetized. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD by subscribing to our newsletter. Sign up at newsletter.ntd.com, where you can access all of our content. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.